Thoughts podcast. I am your host, writer, and comedian Andrew Ingram. I wrote a book. It's called Midnight Thoughts. This is the audiobook. Yes, I'm doing the audiobook as a podcast because I want it to be free and I want it to be available for as many people as possible, I guess. I'm really proud of this book. I wrote it over the course of a few years because it's a short story collection. There are 16 short stories, and we're probably going to have 17 or 18 episodes just because a couple of them are pretty long, and we may break those up. I'm still in the process of recording some of the episodes. As we speak, I think I have 5 or 6 recorded right now, and so we're going to start putting out the episodes here in a couple weeks. I'm just recording the first intro now to get a feel for how I want to do this. But as you'll probably hear me say a lot of times as we're going through this journey together, I believe perfect is the enemy of good. I'm an artist who has a day job, who doesn't like compromising his values to make money doing what he loves. So making art isn't about being the biggest or the best in the industry. Making art's about being human. It's something we should all be doing. It's something that enriches your life, and it's something we should share with each other. So that's the process, I wanted to commit to with this podcast. I wanted to share my work in a format that I think maybe more people I hang out with day to day relate to, and that's an audio medium at this point. And if I'm being honest, it's something I relate to pretty hard in this day and age. I listen to a lot of podcasts, I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I wanted to contribute to that medium. So welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. The first story in the book is, of course, Death Waits for One Woman. This is a favorite of mine. I wrote it after my grandmother died, and it's maybe the first piece of fiction I wrote that I actually thought was good. And I honestly think it's one of the best stories in the book. So I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you guys on the other side of this episode. The book is called Midnight Thoughts. It's by me, Andrew Scott Ingram. There's a copyright page, there's a dedication I'm just not going to read. The first story, Death Waits for One Woman. Mrs. Morrison was too busy to die. At least that's what she told Death when she caught him creeping up on her from the corner of her eye. "I'm far too busy to die today," she said, without looking up from the biscuit dough she kneaded between strong calloused fingers. "Why don't you come around in a bit?" Death hesitated, taken aback by Mrs. Morrison's cool rejection. Many of Death's victims pleaded. A few raged, but he could not remember the last time one of his quarries flat out denied his advances. Still, just Death had a job to do. So he reached his icy hand out for Mrs. Morrison and received a sharp rap across his knuckles from the woman's rolling pin. She gave Death a no-nonsense glare she'd perfected during 15 years as a wife and 12 years as a mother. If Death had blood, it would have run cold. "Now, Grim, I've told you already. I've got too much to do to come with you today," she said, her eyes peering unafraid into the unfathomable darkness of his hood. She opened a drawer and pulled out a gleaming blade of serrated steel. "If you'd like to hurry this along, you can cut carrots," she said, offering him the blade hilt first. If Death could have spoken to the living, he would have expressed outrage at Mrs. Morrison's impertinence, but instead he accepted the knife and began cutting carrots. "Please cut them a bit thinner than that. Little Marcus is going through a bit of a picky phase," Mrs. Morrison said. Death complied, and Mrs. Morrison returned to her biscuits. You could have taken me just now if you hadn't taken my James 2 years back," she said. "Then he could have made dinner." "Oh well, I suppose you were just doing your job." After the carrots, Mrs. Morrison put Death to work cutting up potatoes and then onions before asking him to wash dishes while she mixed the vegetables with ground chuck and beef broth. As she put the stew on the stove, Marcus came tearing through the front door, babbling as children do about the trials and adventures he'd undertaken at the school that day. "Grim, be a dear and stir while I get Marcus settled in. If he doesn't get started on his homework before supper, it'll never get done." Death, defeated, simply took the wooden spoon and began to stir without protest.
When the stew had simmered for a good 45 minutes, Mrs. Morrison declared it fit for human consumption and politely asked if Death would stay for dinner. The silent figure just shook his hooded head. "Well then, dearie, thank you so much for your help today," Mrs. Morrison said brightly. "I'm booked up through next Tuesday, busy, 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 but if you'd like to pop in around next Wednesday, I might be able to find some time for you after Marcus has gone to sleep. Say around 9:30? Death nodded, then paused, shocked. Why had he agreed to this mortal's request? He'd never done such a thing before. He gave a shrug. As he left the house behind, he'd ask her on Wednesday, after her life ended. Wednesday came, and at the appointed time Death appeared. Mrs. Morrison stood in her nightgown, folding laundry in her bedroom. "Oh, hello," she said. Were we supposed to meet tonight? I'd honestly forgotten. Things have been so crazy around here lately. Little Marcus has joined Pee Wee football, and I just got named project manager at work. I'm afraid I just don't have the time to slip this mortal coil just yet." She went to her bedside table and pulled out her day planner. "Let's see. Marcus's last game will be the second Saturday in June, and if things go according to schedule, the project will wrap up July 12th. But these things rarely do, so why don't we just say sometime in early August?" Death's shoulders slumped. "Oh, don't sulk, dear. You'll ruin your posture," Mrs. Morrison chided. "I'm penciling you in for the 3rd. Now, if you wouldn't mind, garbage pickup is tomorrow morning, and I completely forgot to make little Marcus take out the cans. Would you mind taking care of them on your way out?" Almost against his will, Death's shoulders straightened, and he left Mrs. Morrison's room to locate the garbage cans. As he placed them on the curb, he was struck with the realization he most likely would not be claiming Mrs. Morrison's life August 3rd, or any time in the foreseeable future. The thought was accompanied by a panic Death had never experienced. What if others figured out how to avoid me, he thought. I'd never be able to live it down. His private joke cheered him slightly, but Death remained troubled. Sure enough, August came, and little Marcus, who, after a summer growth spurt, could hardly be called little anymore, was starting 6th grade. Mrs. Morrison couldn't be expected to die while her son adjusted to the cruel environment of middle school. "And would you be a good duck and grab the mail, please, before you go? Thank you so very much." In December, there was Christmas shopping to do, and in April, Mrs. Morrison's sister Alice came to stay for a bit, having just gotten out of drug rehab. "And I'll thank you not to spread that around, Grim. Now, would you mind dusting above the fireplace? I'm just a bit too short." After this, Death gave it a few years. But when he returned, Marcus was about to head to college. The year after that, Mrs. Morrison was made the first female vice president at her company. 2 years later, Marcus had just moved back in. "I couldn't possibly leave now. He's taken up with a girl named Sarah who's just no good at all. Maybe you could pay her a visit." "Oh, don't look at me like that, Grim. Just set the table, please." A year and a half after that, Mrs. Morrison was neck deep into planning the happy couple's wedding. "Oh, that girl won me over in the end. I don't care for the body art, but she's a wizard of a chef. Her soufflés are to die for. Now, I've got the time. I just don't have the time just yet. Now, those gutters aren't going to clean themselves." As the years came and went, Death found he looked forward to his encounters with Mrs. Morrison. She treated him like a handyman, but Death had never been anything other than what he was, and he'd come to find the change of pace interesting, even enjoyable. After 12 years of intermittent visits, Death realized he did not want to reap Mrs. Morrison. In fact, the thought of doing so troubled him greatly. So Death stopped visiting the woman he'd come to admire. Being who he was, Death knew the goings-on of her life. He knew the goings-on of everything that would die one day. But he did not approach her. He watched Mrs. Morrison's life, and the life of her son and daughter-in-law, and eventually her grandchildren, with an interest he'd never shown other living things. And he agreed with her. Mrs. Morrison was indeed much too busy to die. She shepherded her company into the 21st century. She made beautiful meals from scratch for her grandchildren and sang in the church choir every Sunday. After she retired, she traveled, started a healthcare charity, and stood in the front row of her granddaughter's punk band's first concert. Death watched all of this, and he watched Mrs. Morrison get sick. Doctors were hopeful for a few months, and then they weren't. Mrs. Morrison got skinny and pale in the hospital, and one day she asked to go home. Her family gathered around her bed, and she told them each the things she loved most about them, and kissed them all with withered lips. And then Mrs. Morrison said, "Grim, I think I can spare the time for you now." Death appeared, and he took the old woman's hand. They were alone in the place between places, and Death asked, "How did you do it?" His voice crinkled like the pages of an old book. "How did I do what, dear?" Mrs. Morrison asked. "How did you get me from taking you?" "Oh, that? I just had things to do, so I told you I couldn't come," she said. "Hasn't anybody else ever done that?" "No." "Oh, interesting. Grim, can I see my James now?" "Yes, Mrs. Morrison. Give him my regards." "Goodbye, Grim." And Death was left alone. Oh, shit. So, I forgot how sad that got in the end. I haven't read this since I wrote it. I got emotional reading my own words, which is super embarrassing. And that's the magic of getting to hear this as a podcast instead of as a real audiobook read by a professional who deserved to get money from me.
Thanks for listening, everybody. That was Death Waits for One Woman, the first story, the first episode of Midnight Thoughts. If you enjoyed that, you can always buy the book and read ahead. It's available on Amazon, or you shoot me a DM. I probably have copies. I could just send you one. Our theme song, which I'm dubbing Cyberpunk Panic Attack, was created by my buddy Vince. Check him out at False Idols. He's an amazing beat maker and a swell dude. If you want to follow more what I do, learn about my stand-up, learn about upcoming writing projects I have, follow me on social media. I'm pretty active on Instagram at Andrew Ingram 88. And I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter too at Drew Joker, but I don't do anything there anymore. It's a hellscape now. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I will catch you next week.